The dusty streets of Custer, South Dakota, had never felt more suffocating than they did on that blistering afternoon in August of 1883. When Beatrice Lambert walked past the mercantile and heard Mrs. Henderson's voice pierce through the thick air like a knife, announcing loud enough for half the town to hear that it was a crying shame how a woman of 40 years still had no husband to speak of. Beatrice's spine stiffened, but she kept walking, her worn leather boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk with each deliberate step. She had heard it all before, the whispers and the not-so-subtle remarks about how she had let her best years slip away, how she was too particular, too independent, too everything that a woman was not supposed to be in this hard-scrabble corner of the Dakota Territory. The general store needed supplies, and Beatrice was not about to let small-minded gossip keep her from running her late father's ranch. She pushed through the door, the bell chiming overhead, and made her way to the counter where old Mr. Patterson was tallying up accounts in his ledger. He greeted her with the same respectful nod he always did, one of the few people in town who seemed to see her as more than just an unfortunate spinster. She ordered what she needed: flour, coffee, salt, and ammunition for the Winchester rifle that had become as familiar to her as her own shadow. Outside, the August sun beat down mercilessly on the Black Hills region, turning the earth to dust and testing the resolve of every rancher trying to make a living from the unforgiving land. Beatrice loaded her supplies into the back of her wagon, her calico horse stamping impatiently in the heat. She was just about to climb up into the driver's seat when she heard the commotion down the street. A group of men had gathered outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, their voices raised in anger. Beatrice recognized most of them as ranch hands from the surrounding properties, men who spent more time drinking their wages than earning them. In the center of the group stood a stranger, tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of hard living. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt that sat low on his hips, but what caught Beatrice's attention was the way he stood his ground, calm and steady, even as the other men crowded around him with hostile intent. She could not hear what they were saying, but she could see the situation escalating. The stranger said something that made one of the men lunge forward, fists raised. Before Beatrice could think better of it, she found herself striding toward the confrontation, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip crack. "That is quite enough," she called out, her tone brooking no argument. "Whatever quarrel you men have can surely be settled without resorting to brawling in the middle of the street like a pack of wild dogs." The men turned to look at her, surprise evident on their sun-weathered faces. Tom Grady, a particularly unpleasant character who worked for the Jacobson Ranch, sneered at her. "This does not concern you, Miss Lambert. Why do you not run along and tend to your kitchen, or whatever it is old maids do with their time?" The stranger's eyes flickered to her face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Before she could respond to Grady's insult, the stranger spoke up, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of time spent further south. "The lady asked you men to disperse. Seems like the polite thing to do would be to respect her request." "And who the hell are you to tell us what to do?" Grady demanded, taking a step closer to the stranger. "Name is Frank Patterson," the stranger said evenly. "Just rode into town looking for work, and I would prefer not to start my time here by breaking anyone's jaw, but I will if you push me to it." There was something in the way Frank Patterson said those words, a quiet confidence that suggested he was more than capable of backing up the statement. Grady seemed to sense it too, because after a moment of tense silence, he spat into the dust and turned away, muttering something under his breath about strangers and interfering women. The other men followed his lead, dispersing back toward the saloon or their horses. Frank turned to Beatrice and touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged for the intervention, madam, though I reckon you just made yourself some enemies on my account." "Those men have been enemies of common decency for years," Beatrice replied, studying him more closely now. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a striking shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds rolling over the prairie. There were lines around them that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious. What was the trouble about? "Accused me of cheating at cards last night," Frank said, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "Funny thing is, I only got into town this morning. Wrong man, wrong time, but they were not much interested in listening to reason." "That sounds like Tom Grady and his friends," Beatrice said. "They have never let facts get in the way of a good fight." She paused, then added, "You said you were looking for work." "What kind of work?" "Ranch work, mostly," Frank replied. "I am good with horses, decent with cattle, and I can fix just about anything that breaks. Been working ranches from Texas up through Colorado for the past 15 years. Figured I would try my luck up here in the Dakota Territory." Beatrice considered this. She had been running her father's ranch alone for the past 2 years since he had passed, managing with the help of one elderly ranch hand named Charlie, who was more companion than employee these days. The place was small by most standards, about 200 acres with a modest herd of cattle and a dozen horses, but it was more than she could properly maintain by herself. She had been reluctant to hire anyone, partly because of the cost and partly because she did not trust easily, but something about Frank Patterson struck her as genuine. "I might have worked for you," she said slowly. "My ranch is about 5 miles north of town. The pay is fair and the work is honest. I cannot promise much beyond that." Frank's expression brightened slightly. "That is more than I had when I woke up this morning, madam. When would you want me to start?" "Now, if you are able," Beatrice said. "Throw your gear in the back of my wagon, and I will take you out to the place. We can discuss the details on the way." As they rode out of Custer, the town falling away behind them in a haze of dust and heat, Beatrice found herself wondering what she had just done. She knew nothing about this man except that he had stood up to a group of bullies and had kind eyes. But there was something in her gut, some instinct that told her this was the right decision, that Frank Patterson was someone she could trust. The ride to the ranch gave them time to talk. Frank told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16, about the years he had spent drifting from place to place, never quite finding somewhere that felt like home. He spoke matter-of-factly about the hardships he had faced, without self-pity or complaint, and Beatrice found herself appreciating his honesty. In turn, she told him about her father, about how he had taught her everything he knew about running a ranch because she was his only child, and he had refused to see that as a limitation. She told him about the struggle to keep the place going after his death, about the way the other ranchers in the area had expected her to fail or sell out. She did not tell him about the loneliness, about the long evenings in the ranch house with only her own thoughts for company, about the ache that sometimes settled in her chest when she thought about the life she might have had if she had been different, if she had wanted different things. When they arrived at the ranch, Frank took in the property with a practiced eye. The house was small but well-maintained, painted white with green shutters. The barn needed some work, and the fencing could use reinforcing, but overall it was clear that this was a place that had been cared for with dedication and pride. "It is a good piece of land," Frank said as he climbed down from the wagon. "You have done well keeping it going on your own." "I have had help," Beatrice said, nodding toward the old man who was emerging from the barn. "Frank Patterson, Meet Charlie Wells. Charlie has been with my family since before I was born." Charlie shuffled over, his weathered face breaking into a gap-toothed grin. "About time you hired some young blood around here," he said to Beatrice. "I keep telling you I am too old to be mucking stalls and mending fences." "You are too stubborn to admit you are too old for anything," Beatrice retorted, but there was affection in her voice. She turned to Frank. "Charlie will show you where you can bunk. We eat supper at 6. Tomorrow morning we start at dawn." Over the following weeks, Frank settled into the rhythm of ranch life with an ease that surprised Beatrice. He was as good as his word, skilled with horses and tireless in his work. More than that, he brought a presence to the ranch that had been missing, a sense of vitality and possibility. Charlie took to him immediately, and even the livestock seemed calmer with him around. But it was the small things that Beatrice noticed most. The way Frank always made sure to fix her a cup of coffee in the morning before heading out to work. The way he would pause whatever he was doing if she needed to discuss something about the ranch, giving her his full attention. The way he looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with something that looked almost like admiration. One evening in late September, as the air was beginning to carry the first hints of autumn chill, Beatrice and Frank sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold. Charlie had already turned in for the night, leaving them alone with the cricket song and the distant lowing of cattle. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said, his voice quiet in the gathering darkness. "Of course," Beatrice replied, though she felt her shoulders tense slightly. "Why is it that a woman like you never married?" he asked. "And before you get your hackles up, I am not asking because I think there is anything wrong with you. Quite the opposite. I am asking because I cannot figure out how every man in this territory could be such a fool." Beatrice was silent for a long moment, considering her answer. "I suppose I never found anyone who saw me as a partner rather than a piece of property," she said finally. "The men who courted me when I was younger, they wanted a wife who would be content to stay in the house and have babies and never have an opinion about anything of consequence. My father raised me to think for myself, to work hard, to believe I was capable of anything. I could not give that up, not even for the promise of security or social acceptance. And so you chose to be alone rather than compromise who you are," Frank said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Beatrice said simply. "Though I will admit there have been times when I wondered if I made the wrong choice. Times when the loneliness felt like it might swallow me whole." Frank reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I do not think you made the wrong choice," he said. "I think you were waiting for the right man." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at him, seeing the earnestness in his face, the way his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "And do you think you are that man?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would like the chance to prove it," Frank said. "I know I am just a drifter with no property to my name and nothing to offer you but my own 2 hands and whatever is in my heart. But Beatrice, from the moment I met you, standing up to those men in town like an avenging angel, I knew you were someone extraordinary. These past weeks working alongside you, watching the way you run this ranch with such determination and grace, I have fallen in love with you. And I do not give a damn that you are 40 years old, or that the busybodies in town think there is something wrong with you for not being married. You are perfect exactly as you are." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes, and she realized with a start that they were tears of happiness, not sorrow. "I have fallen in love with you too," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. I had convinced myself I did not need it, that I was content with my life as it was. But you have shown me what I was missing, Frank Patterson." He leaned forward and kissed her then, gentle and tentative at first, then with growing passion as she responded. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, and Frank was grinning like a man who had just struck gold. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "I know it is fast, and I know people will talk, but I am 42 years old and I have spent most of my life wandering. I do not want to wander anymore. I want to build a life here with you if you will have me." "Yes," Beatrice said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Custer. Charlie stood up as Frank's witness, and Mrs. Peterson from the general store stood up as Beatrice's, beaming with genuine happiness for the couple. Beatrice wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had ordered special from the catalog, and Frank wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable in its formality. The ceremony was attended by a handful of people, mostly those who had always treated Beatrice with respect and kindness. Mrs. Henderson was notably absent, as were most of the town's more judgmental citizens, but Beatrice found that she did not care. She was marrying the man she loved, and that was all that mattered. As they stood before the minister, exchanging vows, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was what she had been waiting for, not just a husband, but a true partner, someone who saw her as an equal and loved her for her strength rather than in spite of it. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the ranch. Charlie had insisted on roasting a pig, and several of their neighbors brought dishes and well wishes. As the sun set and the stars began to appear in the vast Dakota sky, Frank pulled Beatrice into a dance, humming a tune since they had no musicians. "Are you happy?" he asked, his lips close to her ear as they swayed together. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Beatrice replied honestly. "Thank you for being patient enough to wait for me to find you." "I think we found each other," Frank said. "And now we have the rest of our lives to figure out what that means." The first year of their marriage was not without its challenges. Running a ranch together required constant negotiation and compromise, as they learned each other's working styles and preferences. There were moments of frustration, times when they butted heads over the best way to handle a particular problem or situation. But there was also laughter and tenderness, and a deepening connection that made even the hardest days worthwhile. Frank proved to be not just a capable ranch hand but a shrewd businessman as well. He had ideas for expanding their operation, for breeding better horses and improving their cattle stock. Beatrice, who had been focused primarily on survival for so long, found herself energized by his vision for the future. Together, they began to transform the ranch from a modest operation into something more substantial. By the spring of 1884, they had hired 2 additional ranch hands and expanded their herd significantly. The ranch was thriving in a way it never had before, and Beatrice found herself feeling genuinely optimistic about the future for the first time in years. It was in early summer that Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. At 41 years old, she knew that pregnancy carried significant risks, and she could not help but worry about what might happen. When she told Frank, he pulled her into his arms and held her close, his voice thick with emotion. "We will get through this together," he promised. "Whatever happens, we will face it as a team." The pregnancy was difficult. Beatrice suffered from severe morning sickness for the first few months, and as she grew larger, the physical demands of ranch work became increasingly challenging. Frank was protective to the point of being overbearing, constantly trying to get her to rest and take it easy, which led to more than a few arguments. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," Beatrice snapped one afternoon when Frank tried to prevent her from helping with the horses. "I know my own limitations." "I am just trying to keep you safe," Frank replied, his frustration evident. "Both of you." "And I appreciate that," Beatrice said, softening slightly. "But I need you to trust me to know what I can handle. I have been taking care of myself for 40 years, Frank. I do not need you to treat me like I am made of glass." They reached a compromise, with Beatrice agreeing to limit her activities and Frank agreeing to stop hovering quite so much. Charlie, watching the two of them navigate this new phase of their relationship, often shook his head with amusement, muttering about stubborn fools who were too in love for their own good. In February of 1885, during a bitterly cold winter storm that howled around the ranch house, Beatrice went into labor. The midwife had to be fetched from town through treacherous conditions, and Frank spent the hours waiting in an agony of worry, pacing the floor and jumping at every sound from the bedroom. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Frank felt his knees go weak with relief. The midwife emerged a few minutes later, a small bundle in her arms. "You have a son," she said, smiling. "A healthy baby boy, and your wife is doing well, though she is exhausted." Frank took the baby in his arms, marveling at the tiny perfect features, the way the infant's hand curled around his finger with surprising strength. When he was allowed into the bedroom, he found Beatrice propped up on pillows, looking pale and tired but radiantly happy. "We have a son," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "We do," Frank agreed, settling beside her on the bed and carefully placing the baby in her arms. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Beatrice said, "What about James?" "After my father, James Patterson," Frank said, trying it out. I like it very much." Watching his wife hold their child, Frank felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. He had spent so many years alone, convinced that this kind of happiness was not meant for men like him. And yet here he was, with a family of his own, a home that was truly his, and a future that stretched out before him full of possibility. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Both of you, more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too," Beatrice replied, looking up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for being exactly who you are." The years that followed were full and rich in ways that Beatrice had never imagined possible. James grew into a sturdy, curious child who followed his father around the ranch like a shadow, already showing signs of Frank's calm temperament and Beatrice's stubborn determination. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in the area. In the spring of 1887, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in December she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. With 2 young children, life on the ranch became even more hectic, but Beatrice and Frank navigated it together, supporting each other through sleepless nights and teething troubles and all the countless small challenges of parenthood. Charlie, who had become a sort of honorary grandfather to the children, spent hours entertaining James and Sarah with stories of the old days, teaching them songs and games from his own childhood. He lived to see James turn 7 and Sarah turn 5 before passing peacefully in his sleep one autumn night in 1892. His loss hit the family hard, but they took comfort in knowing he had spent his final years surrounded by love and laughter. By 1895, the ranch had become one of the most respected properties in the region. James, now 10 years old, was already an accomplished rider and showed a natural gift for working with horses. Sarah, at 8, was proving to be as independent and strong-willed as her mother, much to Beatrice's secret delight. One evening that summer, As the family sat on the porch after supper, James asked his mother a question that had clearly been bothering him. "Mama, is it true that people in town used to say mean things about you because you were not married?" Beatrice glanced at Frank, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Yes," she said honestly. "Some people thought there was something wrong with me because I was not married by the time I was your father's age." "That is stupid," Sarah declared with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. "You are the best mama in the whole world. Why did you wait so long?" James asked, his young face serious. "Because I was waiting for the right man," Beatrice said, reaching over to take Frank's hand. "I knew that I would rather be alone than settle for someone who did not truly see me, who did not respect me as a partner. And then one day, your father rode into town and everything changed." "Tell us the story again," Sarah begged. "About how you saved Papa from the bad men." Frank laughed. "I think it is more accurate to say we saved each other," he said. "Your mother showed me what real courage looked like that day, and I knew right then that she was someone special." As the children listened raptly to the familiar story of their parents' meeting, Beatrice looked out over the ranch, taking in the neat fences and well-maintained buildings, the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture, the garden that Sarah had insisted on helping to plant that spring. This life, this family, this love, it had all been worth waiting for. Later that night, after the children were asleep and she and Frank were alone in their bedroom, Beatrice said quietly, "Do you ever regret it, giving up your freedom to settle down here with me?" Frank pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with the easy familiarity of years together. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "Before I met you, I was not free. I was just lost. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to plant roots and build something lasting. You gave me everything that matters." "The town still talks about us sometimes," Beatrice said. "About how I was an old maid who got lucky, or how you must have married me for the ranch." "Let them talk," Frank said. "We know the truth. We know what we have built together, what our marriage really means. That is all that matters." "You are right," Beatrice said, feeling the last lingering traces of old insecurities dissolve. "I spent so many years caring what other people thought, trying to justify my choices to myself and everyone else. But the truth is, everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. I was not unlucky or pathetic or any of the other things people said. I was just waiting, waiting for you." "And I was wandering," Frank said, "trying to find my way to you. It just took us both a little longer than most people, that is all." They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Beatrice thought about the girl she had been at 20, full of pride and determination, refusing to compromise her sense of self for the sake of social acceptance. She thought about the woman she had been at 40, lonely but unbroken, still holding on to hope even when it seemed foolish to do so. And she thought about the woman she was now, at 52, finally and fully at peace with herself and her life. The seasons continued to turn, bringing new challenges and new joys. In 1898, when Beatrice was 55 and Frank was 57, James announced his intention to marry a young woman named Catherine Miller, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. The wedding was held at the ranch in the spring, a large and joyous affair that brought together friends and family from across the territory. Watching her son dance with his new bride, Beatrice felt Frank's arm slip around her waist. "We did well," he said softly. "Look at them. Look at how happy they are." "We did do well," Beatrice agreed. "Both of them know their own minds and they are not afraid to stand up for what they believe in. I could not ask for more than that." Sarah, now 16 and showing every sign of becoming as formidable as her mother, had already declared her intention to attend the new teachers' college in Pierre. She had no interest in marrying young. She informed her parents, and she intended to see something of the world before settling down. Beatrice, remembering her own fierce independence at that age, supported her daughter's ambitions wholeheartedly, much to the dismay of some of their more traditional neighbors. By the turn of the century, as the new century dawned bright with promise, the ranch had been in the Patterson family for nearly 2 decades. James and Catherine had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, allowing Frank and Beatrice to step back and enjoy their accomplishments. They had 3 grandchildren now, with a 4th on the way, and the ranch was thriving under James's capable management. On a warm evening in June of 1900, Frank and Beatrice sat in their usual spot on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. At 60 years old, Beatrice's hair was now more silver than brown, and Frank's face was deeply lined from years of work in the sun, but their hands were still clasped together, their connection as strong as ever. "You remember that first day?" Frank asked. "When you invited a complete stranger to come work on your ranch?" "I remember thinking you had kind eyes," Beatrice said. "And I remember being absolutely terrified that I was making a huge mistake." "Best mistake you ever made," Frank teased. "Best decision I ever made," Beatrice corrected. "You were right, you know. All those years ago when you said I was waiting for the right man, I was waiting for you even though I did not know it. Everything I went through, all the loneliness and judgment and hardship, it all led me to exactly where I needed to be." "We found each other at just the right time," Frank said. "Not too early, when we were still too young and foolish to appreciate what we had, but right when we were ready to build something lasting." Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family, James and Catherine putting the children to bed, Sarah practicing a new song on the piano Frank had bought her for her 18th birthday. The ranch that had once been so quiet, so empty, was now filled with life and love and laughter. "I have been thinking," Beatrice said, "about writing down our story, not for publication or anything like that, but for the children and grandchildren, so they will always know how we came to be here, how we found each other." "I think that is a fine idea," Frank said. "Though you will have to write the part about you standing up to those men in town. I was too busy being impressed to remember all the details." Beatrice laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. "We will write it together," she said. "That seems only fitting, given that we have done everything else together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Frank pulled Beatrice close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat that way for a long time, comfortable in their silence, secure in the knowledge that they had found what so many people spent their whole lives searching for. A love that was true and deep and lasting, a partnership built on mutual respect and admiration, a home that was more than just a place but a feeling of belonging. The town of Custer had grown and changed over the years. Mrs. Henderson had passed away, and most of the people who had gossiped about Beatrice's unmarried status had moved on or forgotten their old judgments. The younger generation knew Beatrice and Frank Patterson as pillars of the community, respected ranchers who had built something substantial through hard work and dedication. Sometimes young women from town would seek Beatrice out, asking for advice about their own lives and choices. She always told them the same thing, that it was better to wait for the right person than to settle for the wrong one, that there was no shame in being true to yourself even when the world tried to tell you otherwise, that love could come at any age if you were brave enough to remain open to it. In 1903, Sarah returned from Teachers College with her degree and immediately announced her engagement to a young lawyer she had met in Pierre. The wedding was held in the fall, and Beatrice cried tears of joy as she watched her daughter promise her life to a man who clearly adored and respected her fierce intelligence and independent spirit. "That is what I always wanted for them," Beatrice told Frank that night. For both of them to find partners who see them as equals, who love them for who they really are. "They learned from the best example," Frank replied, kissing her forehead. "They grew up watching us work side by side, watching us respect each other and support each other. Of course they would look for the same thing in their own marriages." The ranch continued to prosper, and as the years passed, it became clear that the Patterson legacy would endure for generations. James and Catherine had 5 children in total, and Sarah and her husband added 3 more grandchildren to the growing family. The ranch expanded to include more land, more livestock, and eventually several hired hands to help with the increased workload. Frank and Beatrice settled into a comfortable semi-retirement, spending their days tending a large garden, taking long rides across the property they knew so well, and spoiling their grandchildren with stories and treats. They had lived long enough to see the wild frontier of their youth transform into something more civilized, to see Custer grow from a rough mining town into a proper community with schools and churches and paved streets. Through it all, their love remained constant, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. They still held hands when they walked, still sat together on the porch every evening to watch the sunset, still found reasons to laugh and tease and enjoy each other's company. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1904, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. James had arranged for a photographer to come from town, and the family posed for a formal portrait, 3 generations standing together in front of the ranch house. When Beatrice saw the finished photograph weeks later, she was struck by how much they had all accomplished, how the scared, lonely woman she had been at 40 had transformed into this matriarch surrounded by love. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet once more, Frank presented Beatrice with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting to be filled. "For our story," he said, "so you can write it all down just like you wanted." Beatrice opened the journal, running her fingers over the smooth pages. On the inside cover, Frank had written an inscription in his careful, precise handwriting. "To Beatrice, the love of my life, you were worth every mile I traveled to find you." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For this, for everything, for being exactly the man I needed exactly when I needed you." "You saved me just as much as I saved you," Frank said. "Maybe more. I was just drifting before I met you, no purpose, no direction. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building. You gave me a home." They sat together late into the night, talking about their life, about the journey that had brought them together, about the future they could see stretching out before their children and grandchildren. Beatrice began to fill the journal's pages with their story, and over the following months, it became a labor of love, a testament to the truth that love could come at any age, in any form, as long as you were brave enough to recognize it and strong enough to hold on to it. By 1910, Frank and Beatrice were both in their late 60s, moving a bit slower but still vital and engaged with the world around them. The ranch was now firmly under James's management, and he had proven himself more than capable of carrying on the legacy his parents had built. Sarah had become a well-respected educator in Pierre, advocating for women's rights and education reform with the same fierce determination her mother had once applied to running a ranch alone. The grandchildren, ranging from teenagers to young adults now, were beginning to make their own marks on the world. Several of them had expressed interest in taking over the ranch eventually, while others pursued different dreams: law, medicine, business. Watching them spread their wings filled Frank and Beatrice with pride and satisfaction. One crisp autumn morning, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the chill, Beatrice said thoughtfully, "You know, I used to be so angry about all those years I spent alone. I felt like life had cheated me, like I had been punished for refusing to conform to what everyone expected. But now, I see it differently. Those years made me who I am. They taught me to be strong, to be self-reliant, to know my own worth. Without them, I might not have recognized you when you came along. I might not have been ready for you. And I needed those years of wandering," Frank said. "I needed to see enough of the world to know when I had found the place I wanted to stay. If I had settled down earlier with someone else, I never would have ended up in Custer that day. I never would have met you. So it all worked out exactly as it was meant to," Beatrice said. "Even the hard parts, even the lonely parts. Especially those parts," Frank agreed. "They taught us to appreciate what we have." The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning chill, and around them the ranch hummed with activity. They could hear James directing the ranch hands, could see Catherine hanging laundry in the yard while her youngest children played nearby. It was a scene of domestic harmony and prosperity, built on the foundation that Frank and Beatrice had laid together all those years ago. In 1912, as Frank approached 70 and Beatrice turned 69, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Their children had offered to throw a party, but Frank and Beatrice had declined, preferring to spend the evening in their own company, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. 28 years, Beatrice mused. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I cannot remember what my life was like before you, Frank said. Or rather, I can remember, but it seems like it happened to someone else, some other man who did not know what he was missing. Do you think we will have many more years together? Beatrice asked, a question she had been afraid to voice until now. I think we will have exactly as many as we are meant to have, Frank replied. And however many that turns out to be, I will be grateful for every single day. They did have more years together, as it turned out. Years filled with the simple pleasures of growing old beside someone you loved, of watching your family flourish and expand, of knowing that your life had mattered, that you had built something lasting. Frank lived to see his 75th birthday in 1917, still sharp in mind if slower in body. Beatrice, now 74, remained his constant companion, just as she had been since that fateful day in Custer 34 years earlier. They spent their final years together in the ranch house that had witnessed so much of their life, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren who were just beginning to toddle around on unsteady legs. When Frank finally passed peacefully in his sleep in the early spring of 1918, Beatrice grieved deeply but without despair. She had been blessed with nearly 34 years of marriage to the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and loved her exactly as she was. She had known a partnership that many people never found, had experienced a love that had sustained her through joy and hardship alike. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see the end of the Great War, long enough to see women finally gain the right to vote, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild in her arms. When she passed away quietly in her sleep in 1923, surrounded by family, her final words were of Frank and how she would be seeing him soon. At her funeral, Sarah read from the journal Beatrice had filled with their story, sharing with the gathered crowd the tale of a woman who had refused to settle, who had been shamed and judged and dismissed, but who had held onto her sense of self until the right man came along and said the words she had needed to hear. You were waiting for the right man. The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own chapter to the story that Frank and Beatrice had begun. And always, on the anniversary of their wedding, the family would gather to remember the couple who had proven that love could bloom at any age, that it was never too late to find your person, that waiting for the right thing was always better than settling for the wrong one. Their story became legend in Custer, told and retold until the details took on an almost mythical quality. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth. Two people who had both spent years feeling lost and alone had found each other at exactly the right moment, and had built a life together that was richer and fuller than either could have imagined. And that truth, that reality of love found and cherished and sustained, was more powerful than any myth could ever be.